In the 1970s, a boy named Andrew Basiago said he was part of a secret U.S. government program, one that trained children to teleport, time travel, and eventually visit Mars. He said they used something called a chronovisor, a device that could look into the past like a hologram suspended in air. He claimed he traveled to Gettysburg in 1863 and was caught in a photograph. Later, he said he met a young Barack Obama on Mars. Either this is the most specific childhood lie in history, or something truly bizarre was happening in a basement under New Jersey. This is Project Pegasus. Welcome back to Time Slipped. I'm your host, Nikki Rich. And today we're diving into a story that sits somewhere between Cold War science, science fiction, and the world's strangest take your kid to work day. This is the story of Project Pegasus, a supposed U.S. government experiment that allegedly used children as time travelers. And one of those kids grew up to become a lawyer, a presidential candidate, and the most confidently strange whistleblower you've never heard of. If you were to meet Andrew Basiago, you'd see he doesn't look or act like your typical conspiracy theorist. He's not broadcasting from a bunker or selling quantum supplements out of his trunk. He's a Columbia University grad, a practicing attorney in Washington State, and he ran for president in 2016. And for most of his adult life, he's been calmly, relentlessly insisting that between the ages of 6 and 12, he was a child participant in a classified DARPA program, also known as the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And DARPA reportedly ran a secret program that used teleportation and time travel for national security purposes. Basiago calls it Project Pegasus. And if you're thinking this sounds like an elaborate sci-fi script that somehow escaped from the 1980s, you're not wrong. But before we laugh it off, it's worth noting that America does have a long history of funding secret experiments that sound absurd until they turn out to be real. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency was founded in 1958. Its job? To make sure the United States would never again be technologically surprised, like it was when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. And to their credit, DARPA's fingerprints are all over history. They funded early versions of the internet, GPS, stealth aircraft, night vision, even self-driving cars. In other words, when DARPA experiments, the world changes. So the idea that they might have poked at something as wild as time travel doesn't sound totally out of place, until you remember that time travel, according to everything we know about physics, is not something you can prototype. Still, the 1960s and 70s were a strange, feverish time for government science, and we've spent a lot of time in these decades here on Time Slipped. I mean, the CIA's MK-Ultra program was experimenting with mind control and LSD. The military's Stargate project, which we'll get to, tried to train psychic spies in remote viewing, literally teaching people to see across time and space with their minds. None of it worked, or at least that's what we're told. But it showed the mindset. If it even might work, let's fund it. If it might give us an edge, explore it. If it sounds like science fiction, double the budget. So in that atmosphere, post-Vietnam paranoia, Cold War secrecy, and a defense budget that could fund a small moon base, a story like Project Pegasus doesn't sound completely impossible. So where does Andrew Basiago come in? Well, his father was an engineer for a defense contractor that worked with DARPA, and through him, young Andrew was brought into the program, tested, trained, and eventually sent through what he called teleportation experiments. The first lab, he says, was in New Jersey. He described stepping into a pair of elliptical booms, two curved metal arms generating what he called a radiant energy field. Step through it, and the world would fade, collapse, and reassemble in another place or another time. And that, he said, was just the beginning. He says they started small, jumping short distances, moving objects across space. Then further. Days, years, decades. Before the jumps got physical, Basiago says they started with what he called chronovisor sessions. And the chronovisor was something that the Vatican claims to have used to see through time. And if you're interested in that, go back to episode 1 of this podcast. So, the chronovisor. It's a way to see through time, not travel through it, by projecting holographic images of real historical events. A team used it to train the children to recognize what they'd eventually step into, and once they could handle watching the past, they were sent inside it. In one of his first missions, Gettysburg, 1863. According to Basiago, he was sent to observe Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Keep in mind he's a child, so this is extra weird. He arrived, disoriented, in the middle of the crowd, wearing oversized shoes and a Union Bugle Boy's coat. He was told to blend in, observe, and return. Nothing more. There is, in fact, a real photograph from the event. The Josephine Cobb photograph, taken in November 1863 and now housed at the National Archives. In it, you can see Abraham Lincoln standing at the center, hat removed, surrounded by soldiers and citizens. To one side stands a young boy, awkward posture, looking straight toward the camera, and Basiago says, "That's him." He insists it's proof. Skeptics say it's coincidence. The photo was discovered in the 1950s and publicized in the 70s long before Basiago began speaking publicly. No analysis has ever linked it to him beyond his own testimony, but to his followers, it's compelling. A real artifact, a hint of something possible. And that's how Project Pegasus stories tend to work. They're built on almosts. Almost verifiable, almost possible, almost familiar enough to believe. Now here's where the story gets even stranger. Basiago says the technology used in Project Pegasus was based on the recovered papers of Nikola Tesla, papers allegedly seized by the US government after Tesla's death in 1943. And that part is true. When Tesla died at the New Yorker Hotel in New York City, the FBI's Office of Alien Property did, in fact, confiscate his files. They wanted to know whether any of his inventions could pose a national security risk. Among those documents were notes on dynamic theory of gravity and electromagnetic propulsion, ideas that even today are hard to parse. And a government physicist named John G. Trump, yes, Donald Trump's uncle, was assigned to review the papers. And if you want to learn about that one, go back to our episode on the Trumps and whether or not they might be time travelers. So John G. Trump looked at Tesla's papers and concluded they were mostly speculative, not immediately usable. But the papers were never fully released to the public, and that gap, that blank space, became fertile ground for decades of conspiracy. So when Basiago says the government reverse engineered Tesla's radiant energy tech to create teleportation chambers, that idea didn't come from nowhere. It's just a long leap from speculative electromagnetic propulsion to let's send a child to 1863. Still, it's the perfect blend of myth and history. Tesla's genius, government secrecy, Cold War paranoia, all the ingredients for a story that refuses to die. Back to Gettysburg, because that was just the beginning. Basiago said those missions were only the early tests. the earthbound ones. As Project Pegasus advanced, he claimed the technology evolved too. The chronovisor, he said, was just the first tool for viewing time. But once they'd proven it worked, the program shifted focus from seeing through time to stepping off planet. They'd mastered teleportation. So now, he claims, they were experimenting with off-world travel to Mars. He called the teleporters jump rooms. He claimed they were housed at a facility in California and that he wasn't alone. Among his fellow chrononauts, he said, was a young man named Barry Soetoro, better known today as Barack Obama. According to Basiago, the two trained together, teleported to Mars, and returned. Their missions allegedly involved reconnaissance, communication with non-human entities, and surviving an alien environment. In Obama's official comment, when asked by journalists years later, "I have never been to Mars," which, if you think about it, is exactly what someone who had been to Mars would say. But again, no records, no corroborating witnesses, no scientific framework, just a lawyer in Washington state insisting, decades later, that it happened. You know, most people who make grand, unprovable claims fade away. They publish a blog, maybe a book, then disappear. Andrew Basiago never did. He's given dozens of interviews, filed legal documents petitioning the U.S. government to release chrononaut archives. He's spoken at conferences, on radio shows, on Coast to Coast AM, the mothership of the American paranormal. And he doesn't rant. He doesn't spiral. He talks like someone giving a deposition. He's methodical, articulate, consistent. People who've met him say he seems utterly sincere. And that's what makes it unsettling. Because sincerity doesn't equal truth. But it sure makes lies sound better. Andrew Basiago is still around. He's still a lawyer, still giving interviews, still asking to testify before Congress about time travel. He's not rich, not famous. He doesn't sell merch or tours or seminars. He just believes. And belief without profit, without power, that's not delusion. That's devotion. And so what do we do with that? A man who might be mistaken or might be the world's first chrononaut, quietly living in suburban Washington. Either way, he's proof of something, that our hunger for mystery hasn't gone extinct. Now let's pause for a quick reality check. We know that in real-world physics, quantum teleportation exists, but it only transfers information, not people or objects. It's the quantum state of a particle being transmitted to another particle somewhere else. That's it. Teleporting a human would mean disassembling them, atom by atom, transmitting that data, and reassembling it perfectly somewhere else, which, aside from being horrifying, would violate the no cloning theorem of quantum mechanics. So unless DARPA secretly broke the laws of physics 50 years ago, this part of the story doesn't hold up. As for time travel, well, general relativity does allow for theoretical wormholes and closed time-like curves, but even if they exist, stabilizing them would require exotic matter with negative energy, something we've never produced in a lab, let alone walked through. So scientifically, Project Pegasus is fiction. But mythologically, that's another story. Here's what fascinates me most about Project Pegasus. It's a perfect example of what I call the possibility gap. That little space between what we can prove and what we can imagine. Governments thrive in that gap, and so do myths. And I think it's partly because they borrow just enough truth to stay alive. DARPA is real. Tesla's papers were seized, the CIA really did fund mind control and psychic research. So when someone says they also did time travel, your brain doesn't slam the door, it leaves it cracked open. And also there's the emotional layer. Children in secret government programs, that hits something deep. It suggests innocence corrupted, the powerless exploited, and a system so secret it might erase its own mistakes. And it's very believable based on how governments are today, and how they've always been, I guess. Every time a classified project gets declassified, from MK Ultra to drone programs, it reminds us that impossible things have happened before. So even if Project Pegasus never existed, it feels like it could have, and that's enough. Maybe Project Pegasus isn't about escaping time. Maybe it's about escaping regret. The fantasy that somewhere in another timeline, we already fixed everything. Maybe that's why these stories keep coming back. Not because they're true, but because they feel like they should be. Because if time travel existed, maybe someone could go back and stop the wars, the mistakes, the losses. If we believe this story, we become keepers of a forbidden truth. It's the same psychology behind urban legends, cults, even fandoms. We want to know something others don't. That's it for this episode of Time Slipped. If you liked it, leave a review, share it with a friend, or send me a classified memo that accidentally ends up in my inbox. Thanks for listening. I'm Nikki Rich, and we'll see you next time.